Hello, this is John Huey, and I'm here with my co-host Michael Tingley.
Hello.
And this, of course, is the Sober Atheist podcast. And we are in now episode 11. And the title of today's episode is Loss of Program Friends. How does the atheist in recovery cope? And maybe I'll just take a second to talk about what, in the context of this discussion, the word loss means. Well, the word loss obviously is connected with losing people we know through the program, through their demise. If we stay around long enough and we know enough people, sooner or later, inevitably, over the course of time, we're going to lose friends that way. And that's something I'm going to start off talking about today. But also, loss is involved in dealing with people that we are associated with in whatever recovery program we choose to be in, who, for whatever reason, either drink or disappear. Most of the time, what we're talking about when we lose people that way are people that choose to drink or use or continue their prior lives without the benefit of recovery. And that's something that we pretty consistently see over time. A lot of times we're dealing with people in that context who we don't know well, but sometimes we're dealing with people in that context that not only we know well, but people we've invested a lot of time and resources. And even though it's not advisable to get overly emotionally involved with people in these programs, you're human, and that's what happens. You do get involved. And when you lose them that way, it can hurt. Now, what sparked this is not, I don't want this to be a negative thing. I want this to be something that that indicates that there are things to learn from and grow through as a result of this. But what sparked my idea about this particular topic was a situation I went through over a course of about a year and a half, a little more than a year and a half or so. In my core meeting that I went to for many, many years here in Washington, D.C., there's a agnostic atheist meeting that started in September of 1988, and I was one of the first members of. I was at that first meeting, and had been a member of that group for many, many years, and had pretty consistently gone to that group, except for the years when I was not living in the United States, which in the mid 2000s I was not around. So, but for the many years from 88 until last year, I very consistently attended that group. Now, it became a little that group became a little problematic for me because it had been pointed out to me that that group was still affiliated with something called Alcoholics Anonymous, even though it did not operate and run like what anybody would consider to be a regular AA group. And there was almost no discussion of things like the book and the steps and all of that stuff. It was still officially affiliated with AA, and my opinions about that organization are very well known, and I've been very vocal about it. And I had some people call me out on that score. Why are you attending a quote unquote AA meeting? I didn't really consider it to be an AA meeting because it didn't really have anything to do with that program as far as my attendance there and what I heard and what was generally talked about. But that was something that was going around in the back of my mind. And I did have to admit that attendance at such a meeting was a little bit inconsistent with some of my other stated opinions. But I continued to go there because I liked it and I was one of the founding members of it. And I've been going to it for many, many years. But then last year, things started to happen. And what happened was three of my closest friends in that meeting, these three guys who I knew very well and had become very friendly with, and we had spent considerable time over the years going out and socializing after that meeting. Those three people, those three guys that were really my core friends in that meeting, they started to die. You know, one gentleman got cancer and struggled with that for a couple of years and finally passed away from cancer. The second gentleman, uh, he was a real interesting but somewhat hard-headed guy, and he wasn't very careful about his COVID vaccines and the boosters for COVID. And he got COVID on a weekend and was dead the following Wednesday from COVID. And then when I was at his memorial service, he had a large family that insisted on one of these traditional things at a funeral home. I was at that service, and my third friend from that meeting was there. And he told me that he had Lou Gehrig's disease, all right, which took him out a few months later. So it got to the point with these three deaths where I found it difficult physically to go to that room. It just really hit me very, very hard. And, I started to think about it a little bit, and I tried to think about what the essence of that experience was. And, the essence was for me that, that it was basically, for me, the spirit of that room had literally died. It had just gone away. Now, there were other good, nice members in that room, and I didn't have any problems with any of the people in that room. They were very good, nice, solid folks. But, really the essence of that meeting for me was these three friends. And once they were gone, the thought of going back into that room was very difficult for me. I wasn't going to do that. And it made me think about these sorts of things and made me think back in time over people that I've known and what their loss meant to me. So that, Michael, I guess is what I want to try to talk about today.
Yeah, well, I guess you need to explain exactly how you dealt with all of that and how you continue to deal with that. And, does that say more about you than it does that meeting? I mean, if that was the main reasons you went to that meeting and,
Well, yeah, I went to that meeting because I was one of the founding members of that meeting, and I enjoyed going to that meeting, right? But, and maybe it has something to do with my own age and my own, processes that I'm going through. But,
well, we're obviously a lot more aware of mortality at this age.
Oh yeah, obviously.
Once you experience it, and people that are your same age or close by start dropping off, it makes us pause.
Right, but when you're much younger, you go through these things too, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit. some experiences from younger days. But yeah, if I were to think about what my real total reaction to this thing was, well, one, I actually was, gratitude for having known these people, because these were people. In one case, was sober for 42 years. In another case, was sober for nearly 40 years when he died. And the third case was somebody who was sober a little over 20 years, but was somebody who I had met 30 years ago, who had come to that meeting for a while, gotten drunk, gone out, disappeared for at least 5 or 6 years, and then came back to us. And I watched him and saw him not only get sober a second time, but stay sober in the end for over 20 years at the point at which he left us. So actually, I'm not, wasn't sad per se, because I learned a lot from all three of these people, watching them, looking at them, very different people, going through the process of recovering and staying sober and building and achieving and having lasting and meaningful lives. So that part that's not bad at all, because you got friends, right?
Yeah.
But the essence of what they were and what they made the decision I needed to make about that meeting, it just made that decision a lot easier once they were gone.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can understand that.
It was,
The dynamics of a meeting changes dramatically with the people. And I know in my experience, there was a face-to-face meeting I used to go to every Friday night. And there was a particular long-term sober guy there who I identified with and appreciated his perspective. And when he died, I did kind of lose interest in that meeting. It wasn't the same, and I missed the camaraderie and friendship that I had with him. But in a way, it was also just an excuse, because it became a much more traditional meeting when he was gone. He kept the lid on some of that traditional fundamentalism, and I appreciated that, which was one of the reasons I used to go to that meeting. So yeah, I understand that the dynamics changing dramatically, easily.
well, yeah, I mean, and learning how to deal with these things is, in the context of this recovery process that we go through and we talk about on this podcast. You're learning it's like an advanced course in learning about life and other aspects of life,
And
because
death.
and death, yeah, and the loss of life. All right.
Sure.
And it's not just, people in their old age, right?
Right.
When I was still in my 40s, in my late 40s, within the context of that same meeting, right, I had developed a very close personal friendship, family friendship, and just really good, close friendship with a sort of a well-known Washington, D.C. Figure in the Black community in Washington, in the academic and artistic community, a guy by the name of Gaston Neal. Gaston certainly wouldn't mind me speaking his name at this juncture. And Gaston and I were very different. Okay, he was, you know, African American radical from the 50s and 60s, very much connected to things going on around Howard University. And he had a lot of very well-known friends in town, including the mayor and our representative to the House of Representatives, and a lot of people in the artistic community, some of the most famous, well-known people in the Black arts movement from the 50s and 60s was friends of his. And, I'm just this white middle-class kid that somehow or another, got, figured out how to make a few bucks running around selling X-ray machines, security equipment to the government and other people around the world. I had a very different life, I've had just a completely different life. But the friendship we forged in the secular room of a program. And we forged that friendship as brothers. We really became brothers, right? And he was an older man than he was about 15, 16 years, 17 years, I guess, older than I was. And he was about 60 when he got lymphoma. And that was probably around 1997, late 96, early 97. We had known each other since 80, early 89. So in total, before he died, we knew each other 10 years. And I had seen him come in very raw from rehab. And when he passed, he had about 10 years of recovery. And I'll never forget the day he passed. I was down in Jamaica paying a call on the government down there, doing some things, some business with the government of Jamaica. And I'm sitting in my hotel room in Kingston and the phone rings and it's his daughter. And I had just been at an event at his home. This guy was just a very well-known figure and an incredible guy. He actually staged and attended his own wake. He said, I don't want to wake when I'm dead. I'm going to have my wake when I'm alive. And when he knew that the doctors told him he didn't have much longer, he staged this incredible party at his home, right? With all these famous people had flown in and come in, and there were all these, I'm just this white guy, in the middle of this incredible, distinguished crowd in his home.
An awake wake.
The wake, yeah. He
Awake.
had
An awake
wake. He's standing there like a king holding court, everybody kissing him and stuff. And the last thing I said to the guy was, I love you. And he said, I love you too, in my ear, whispered in my ear. And that was the truth. And from that friendship, all right, where he was friendly, and he and his wife and my kids, and we all sort of got together. We had friendship outside of the regular kind of program thingy that normally we socialize together from time to time. And he showed me that you can meet the most unlikely, improbable people when you get involved in recovery and learn things that you would never, ever know or learn otherwise about life, about society, about, I was at a party at his house one day with my ex-wife, wife number 2. And we had a babysitter, so the kids weren't there with us. We were at this sort of garden party type thing he had at his house. And we were the only white couple there. And there were some friends of his, old communist friends of his, and a lot of other old-time radical folks, politically radical, very, very radical folks that were there. And I overheard something. It was somebody said to him, he said to Gaston, what's that white motherfucker doing here? Right? And Gaston looked at him and he said, that motherfucker is a friend of mine. And if you don't like it, you can fucking leave, he said. Now that's a friend, okay, in the middle of his own thing, to stand up for me as a friend, because maybe I was a little out of context in that particular place at that particular
Now,
time.
so this is to go back. This is one of the guys that was at that meeting that you used to go to that
Correct.
passed away.
Correct. That's where I met him. He came
Yeah.
from rehab. He couldn't tolerate, he knew some of the most prominent African American people in that other program in Washington. There were some, he always knew the top people in his community, right? And they all sort of,
Other program, you mean NA
in
versus AA?
NA, he was in Cocaine Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a multi-program guy because he needed he was, I won't go into all the things about him, but he had a lot of stuff in his life. And he couldn't take any of that stuff. And he credited our meeting with finally getting him to the point where he could quit long term. That the secular, he didn't have any relation with or understanding of what those other people were trying to tell him in this with the religiosity and this faith-based programs that they were trying to sell him else. He learned from us that you didn't have to do it that way. And for one reason or another, he and I bonded as friends because we would go to the cafeteria in the GW hospital where we ended up having that meeting for many years before it moved to the Hill Center on Capitol Hill, where it is now. That meeting for many years was in the George Washington University Hospital, same place they took Reagan when he was shot. That was the old GW hospital. It's the new one across the street. And we would sit there and just sort of regale each other with our own tales. And we had an understanding of each other that transcended that program. I'll put it that way. But it was rooted, our friendship was rooted in our sobriety and our mutual determination to stay sober. That was
So how did that affect your relationship with this meeting when he died? And your relationship with the recovery?
When he died, I was in a different place as regards that program. He died in 1999. I didn't become totally disaffected and unaffiliated with that program until 2014, some years later, when I finally realized, by going to that first international convention of atheists and agnostics we had out in Santa Monica in November of 2014, that's when I realized, in fact and in truth, that atheists and agnostics really didn't need that program anymore. And I was done with it, basically, from a program point of view at that point in time. I immediately saw, unlike many people that are in so-called secular AA or whatever they call it now, I immediately saw that it was no longer necessary to put up with or countenance any of that, the tenets of that religious-based program.
Now, is that before or after all these friends of yours that died in that meeting and kind of drove you away from that meeting?
Well, that was 2014. My three friends that died just died a year and a half, starting about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Okay.
But you were saying that
it
affected your relationship with that meeting.
That specific meeting, but my overall relationship with the program of AA ended in 2014.
Yeah.
My own personal affiliation where I would have identified myself as a member of that program. Right? You are what you identify yourself as, right? As far as I'm concerned, and that program's concerned. But to get back to my friendship with Gaston, at that time, it 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 actually even further cemented my relationship with my own sobriety, to have sat with him and see the courage with which he met his demise from that difficult cancer. Lymphoma can be a very difficult cancer. And I was sitting with him at Georgetown University Hospital on a number of occasions when he was going through chemo and was hospitalized as a result of chemo. And I just learned a lot from the guy. I mean, and I never would have learned what I learned if I hadn't had that friendship and that relationship in the program. So the net from knowing that guy, and the net from knowing my three friends who recently passed away, is incredibly positive. But it can change your orientation to and relationship with the way in which you pursue and go about your own sobriety. Right?
And how is
And
that?
it has emotional impact. I mean, we're human beings. We react emotionally to emotional situations.
And how does
And the
that affect
very
your sobriety, John? I'm trying to figure out here why exactly
in
what
my
exactly
case,
are you
it
saying
affected
that
my sobriety
has anything to do with your sobriety? I mean, you
in
talked
a
about not
very
going to
positive.
that meeting because those people aren't there, but now that
But
they're dead and
no,
they left a positive influence
right,
on you.
right. And
So
my
how is the
impact.
loss of that influence? It's still there.
Well, the influence. Here's the funny thing. Okay, in the final analysis, the influence isn't lost.
Right.
My friend Gaston is alive to me today as he was when I went to his funeral in 1999. All right. These other three friends I'm talking about, their influence and positive examples are as alive as they ever were. Right. I had emotional reactions to the loss of friends like any other human being has.
Right.
But the net from all of this, which is maybe one of the points of this whole podcast today, is despite the fact that if we hang around these rooms, we're going to go through loss and a certain amount of pain, that the net of that is positive, right?
Okay.
And it assists in your assimilation with life at large. Because sooner or later, we're going to have to come to terms with our own demise.
Now, how is that any different in life than it is in recovery?
Well, because the friendships that you form in recovery have this life and death aspect to those friendships while those friendships are going on,
Mm-hmm.
that you do not generally have in the same way with friendships and relationships outside of that context. I'm very fortunate. I have a number of friends who are still alive, who I've known for, in one case, 58 years, another case, 55 years, another case, 54, 55 years. People that knew me when I was in the throes of my addictions and drinking, and people that have known me in the 37 years since I quit. But those friendships and relationships tend to be very different, based on mutual interests that go back to my college days. The friendships, the long-term friendships I've formed in recovery, the foundation of those friendships are the recovery process and has been the recovery process itself, and how we discussed and resolved and motivated and understood one another within the context of that process over years. And that's a very positive thing. Okay. I'm maybe suggesting to people, don't be afraid of getting close to people, even if you might lose them, because the net result of that, if the friendships and relationships have been positive, is bound to be positive in the end. All right. Even though it maybe causes you to behave and do things a little bit differently. I mean, in the case of my secular meeting here in Washington, I had to finally admit that I was, in fact, being a bit hypocritical, still going to a meeting, a regular meeting listed in that directory as a regular meeting of that fellowship, which I had categorically rejected, whether or not the meeting itself in general represented the tenets of that program, which I don't believe it does in particular, because I never heard any of that crap there, or very seldom heard any of that crap. So, it's like these things are multifaceted and multi-layered, and just another aspect of how, recovery really enriches your life. And that's the positive side of the coin, right? But there's a negative side to this coin, right? It doesn't have to do with your close friends who stayed sober. It doesn't have to do with your good buddies whose success stories you still learn from. The other side of this coin is losing people that you know and you are close to in one way or another, who don't make it. Right? And, sometimes they die and sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's an awful outcome. Often there's an unknown outcome because they disappear from the world, as far as you're concerned. You don't see them anymore. You don't hear from them anymore. They're gone. And what happened to them, in many cases, you'll never know what happened to them because they depart and they go. And some years ago, I was working with this guy. I won't use his name, but I was working with a guy back in the 90s. He was a good friend of my second wife, and who was also at that time in that program. And he was a very senior guy here in Washington, working for an agency in a very responsible position. We knew in the meetings we went to, we knew a number of people like that. Okay. You met my friend a couple weeks ago who is a big success story, who was a big shot in the government here. And this was another guy who was sort of a big shot, but I swore that I would never allow anybody to break my heart in that program. But this was a person who came around, who struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled, and finally got 1 year of sobriety. And on his first anniversary, I'm not an emotional, I don't do a lot of blubbering, Michael, but I actually blubbered a little bit at his first anniversary because he had struggled so hard and gone so far to get that 1 year milestone in his life. And I would say it was maybe 4 years after that. Oh, no, here's a guy who, it had gotten so bad at one time. Here's a Washington big shot, found in a gutter by the paramedics after having passed out and broken his head open in front of his fancy apartment building, with his wife screaming and crying over his prone form, him having slipped on the curb and broken the head, and the cops and the paramedics and everybody, that he had gone from being scraped up off the street, basically, to having this 1 year of recovery. And I was traveling a lot in those days, and I used to stay in airport hotels in Europe a lot because it was just more convenient. I wasn't going as a tourist, so I would be in and out. And I'm trying to remember whether it was an airport hotel in Amsterdam, or I think it was Amsterdam, or maybe some other town in Frankfurt. No, it was probably Amsterdam. In those days, this is so long ago, that was when the people still called you on the landline. And the landline in the hotel in my room ring, and I pick up the phone, and it's somebody calling me saying, yelling over the phone, so-and-so is lost in Paris. His wife can't find him. He's been gone for 3 days. He's drunk in Paris. Can you go help find him? And I said, I'm sitting here in Amsterdam, wherever it was. I'm getting on a plane, and I'm going home to my family. I'm not going to Paris to scrape him up off the street again. And I said, he broke my heart once. I'm not letting him do it again. Because to roll the thing back, after that 1 year of sobriety, of course, I find out that he's drinking again, right? A couple years later, the phone rings and there's a big emergency that I've got to go I'm going to go try to fix. I said, fuck no, I'm not doing that. There's only so much you can do, but that stuff is worse than losing your old program friends who die on you. You can understand your old program friends that get old and get sick and die on you. That you can understand. But some of this stuff from the people that you tried to help, right, who are dead or not dead, they're not even dead. I mean, they're just lost, right? And then you don't hear anything about them anymore. I've got a million stories like that of people who I really liked. I remember seeing this one guy in his, $1,000 suit sitting in the corner, shaking from DTs, because he would go in the bathroom and drink during the meeting. He would take a break and go in the bathroom and drink during the meeting. And he got sober. And when I saw him go out, I used to run into him and his wife here in Bethesda on the street. And the family was so happy that he was sober, right? And the last I heard of him, he had been thrown out of the house and was on the street. Okay. Went from Washington lobbyist to being broke on the street somewhere. Right? There's a million stories like that. Okay. And those stories are hard to deal with.
But aren't they just good lessons for you? And,
they're good lessons.
Ultimately, a positive outcome for
they're always, oh yeah, for me, as far as getting, staying sober myself, they're good positive. I mean, this is the counterpoint to my great friends who died sober is this other, the rest of this thing, the other part of the coin. But you tried. I mean, the bottom line is you tried and you failed, okay, to help. You didn't fail yourself in terms of your own sobriety, but you did try and it didn't help, all right? And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
Do you think
So
any of that threatens your sobriety? Is it
not to me,
any kind of a trigger at all, or
not at all.
no?
No. But it does engender some sadness. And once you've gone through enough of those experiences, it does make you a little wary of getting too close to other alcoholics sometimes, particularly ones that have had problematic histories. And that's that's unfortunate, right? I was serious when I said that I wasn't going to let any one of them break my heart anymore. But guess what? There have been some instances in these last not so far distant years where they have broken my heart. It's one of the risks of being associated with people in these programs. It's some of it is emotional baggage that you don't need, but you voluntarily take on when you try to be of assistance to some folks, and you have to learn how to manage it. I've learned how to manage it, but I'm not going to say that it's
How is that? How do you manage it,
easy.
John? How do
Well,
you
in
define
this,
that kind
it's
of
a
management?
similar type of thing to, let's say, you're a physician and you become friendly with a patient, which happens sometimes. You do have to get some sort of calcification internally to prepare yourself for the time in which you might have made your best effort to take care of someone, but they die anyway. Doctors, of course, go through that over and over and over again, and I'm sure they get, plenty of advice and support from other physicians as they're coming up as young doctors and they're working in the hospitals and they're being, uh, we don't have the luxury of being in a profession where dealing with that is expected. All right. We expect to be successful dealing with our fellow alcoholics and addicts anytime. We expect that. We expect we're going to be successful. We think, oh, we go through something in our head that says, oh, they finally got it. Okay. Or, oh, they're really well on their way. Right. And then what happens? And how do we deal with that? We don't have the insulation that some of these professional people have when they're dealing with people in these problematic situations. So I think that we have to sort of support each other through these times. I tend to discuss when things like this occur, I tend to discuss this with other people I know in the program that knew the person to try to put the event in context. And that's often very helpful because we come to the conclusion, much of the time, we come to the conclusion, well, we did the best we could. All right. I've taken people to detox who I liked, who I thought had gotten sober, who ended up getting drunk and getting into trouble, and who needed someone to take them to the hospital. I've literally carried them to hospitals to see them dried out and then go on to die from this thing. Even though we'd had some thought in the back of our minds, well, maybe this time they're going to get it, right? And the sad fact is that in these recovery places, these times, a lot of people never get it. And we have to be able to deal with that. And you're absolutely right that we learn from that in terms of our own sobriety. But as human beings, it's hard. And we see it over and over again. And what happens to them? Sometimes I find myself with some of these folks that I've dealt with, deal with, still every once in a while, getting a little hard-hearted about the whole thing. Saying, well,
I guess maybe I have, and from some perspective, an advantage in that I have never been all that close to anyone in AA and the recovery meetings. I mean, I I haven't done a lot of that taking people to detox or anything, and I haven't. I mean, I've been in meetings where people have died and people have gone out and gotten drunk and died or ended up in jail, whatever. But I don't feel any personal responsibility or a lot of personal effectiveness by that. I mean, I haven't really been touched by that very much, and I don't know if that's maybe my sense of isolation away from it and backing away. And I mean, I've gone to meetings for on this stretch almost 19 years, a lot of meetings, and you know I once I leave the meeting, I leave it all behind pretty much. I haven't been all that connected to other people outside of meetings, in
right.
people in the meetings outside of the meetings. So I don't know. I haven't had that kind of experience. I mean,
Well, maybe
in the past, I definitely have been touched by the death of certain people, but that's inside the program and outside the program. It doesn't matter. I mean, that's just part of the human condition. Part of our existence is we experience those things, that sense of loss. But it's never really been a trigger for me. It's never been something that I've really been all that concerned about. And I don't know how much I'm helping other people by being in meetings. I think that's pretty much the only thing I can add to this, to the equation, is that I show up and I'm there. And if that helps somebody stay sober, getting through these things, then fine. But there's really not a lot of there's not much else I can do.
Yeah. Well, you're right, and that's that. We all have our limits, okay? And your emotional involvement with people who are struggling has to be limited to a certain point.
Well,
Maybe
yeah, it's
to a
part of the survival
greater than,
thing too. I mean, you get
yeah,
too entangled with any of that stuff, and
you can't go diving into the chaos of everybody's life that you meet. What I'm sort of referring to is maybe in my own case, I have a long memory going back, it's going to be 38 years in January. I've got all those years of experience now to think about, and all of the people that I've met, and by far, I don't want anybody listening to this to get me wrong. By far, my exposure to people in these programs has been positive. I've seen, better people with better behavior and better outcomes than in almost any other area of life from people who got and stayed sober. Those are the ones that give me the hope and the tenacity and the perseverance to continue in this thing myself.
Yeah.
Not these stories of the people who don't make it. But I had to put in both sides of the coin on this topic in this podcast because it really is two sides. This whole topic of loss, and I put the word friends in here um, because I'm really talking about people that we had some sort of connection with, not people with whom we had no connection with.
Right.
And we cannot be totally involved with every difficult story in the world. That's impossible. But if we hang around these places long enough, sooner or later, we're exposed to problematic things. But by and large, this is a positive, not a negative topic. But there's a word of caution that's necessary to remind people of when they are, in fact, dealing with people with these sorts of problems. If you really deal with them and they have these sorts of problems, sooner or later, somebody's going to break your heart if you're human and you become involved. Now, maybe for many people, or maybe for some, or for many, or maybe even for most people, the best strategy with that is to remain pretty detached. On occasion, I've taken the other tack, all right? And somehow or another, I become somewhat emotionally attached to the success or failure of others. Even if I don't want to, it happens sometimes. And there you are. Many times, though, you're in the situation. I can think back to an instance many, many years ago when we had just started the secular meeting. It was within about, well, not just started, it was probably very early 90s, within about 4 or 5 years of us starting that secular meeting here in DC. We had a very brilliant guy who would come to the meeting and he would pontificate about the nature of addiction. That was his thing. He would go on and on about the nature of addiction and the philosophy of addiction and the science involved in addiction. The only problem was the guy was a heroin addict, right? But he was also a double PhD at NIH, National Institutes of Health. And guess what? The National Institute of Drugs and Alcohol. He was a top scientist at NIDA and was coming to us with his addiction problem. And maybe one of the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered in any of these meetings. But one day I got a phone call. I was still living downtown DC. So it has to be like early 90s, still early 90s, 93, 94, something like that. And I get a phone call and they had found this guy. It was April. And they had found this guy in his car in Southeast Washington with a spike in his arm. And he had been in the car for 4 days, and it was April in DC. It was a nasty scene. And a couple of my good friends there, one of the founders of the meeting, myself, and one of my other friend, my friend Mara and I, we went over to this fancy funeral in Alexandria, Virginia, some fancy Episcopal church place over there. And we went over and went through this memorial, and we were standing around afterwards. And person after we got sort of identified as, oh, those are the people from that program, okay, that he was going to, right? And we had person after person coming up to us and asking us why it happened. And I didn't have the slightest fucking idea why it happened. And that instance, that moment really taught me a lot, because in the final analysis, I really don't know why people do some of these things to themselves, which is almost segueing into another one of our future episodes about how do we atheists deal with mystery, right? But still, some of these deaths, these unfortunate instances, even of people you liked, I wasn't a close friends with that guy, but I happened to like the guy. He was a very interesting person, and I was very sorry to hear what had happened to him. But in the final analysis, I didn't know why. That was a good lesson for me too, because I think I know a lot, right? Right? Okay, I think I know a lot, right? Don't you think? I think I know a lot, but
Yeah.
sometimes I don't. I don't know shit from Shinola, and
Well,
that's a pretty good. That's a pretty good thing to remember too
yeah. Well,
when
look,
we're dealing with these.
for me, the bottom line is that I think it's important that we recognize the positive legacy of those we've lost, and
Right.
and live with that. I mean, that's
That's
the best that we can take away from it,
that's absolutely great,
and that, in a
because
sense, is creates a sense of hope.
that's
That there is.
which is the word that I was groping for.
There you go.
I
Yeah.
keep groping for that word,
I
hope.
think that's the equation.
Okay.
Positive legacy equals hope.
Okay, because when the word hope, is, which is the note upon which, if we're ever going to be remembered for anything, I hope we're remembered for being a more hopeful lot rather than a more negative lot. But when we get to the word hope, we get to the point in the podcast where we think we're done, right,
There you
Cliff?
go. Cool.
You think we're done? You
Yeah,
think
I
we're done?
think we're leaving a little bit, just a tiny positive legacy.
Yeah, and we're leaving a little bit on the table, and and we're also leaving people with the fact that some things we just are never going to know. Okay,
There you go.
we're never going to be
You
sure.
never know.
You're never going to know, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But one thing we are going to be sure of, particularly in the upcoming political season here in 2024, is that we need to go forward in the spirit of what? What do
Hope.
we go forward in the spirit of? Hope. And then with what? What do we
Peace
go
and
forward?
love, baby. Peace and
Peace
love.
and love is what we go forward with.
Yep. Yep.
And we will leave you with that, hopeful, and honestly, our best wishes in that regard for everyone that's been listening to this, I'm sure, completely enlightening discussion we had today. Right?